Oh God, how did we get here? What can we do to bring people like this back to sanity before more die over absurd conspiracy theories? I'm going to try to answer these questions, so listen up if you have a family member who seems to be drifting in this direction.
It's time for guillotines. It's time to raise the voice. It's time to sharpen blades. We just can't take this anymore. It's nothing personal. We gave your way a try. We're sorry, but you at the top all have to die.
First, I want to comment on the simple fact the research on this topic is surprisingly sparse. Given the massive uptick in right-wing terror attacks, and especially in light of the recent violence at the Capitol, I do find it strange that there's been a real outcry against fascism in America as well. There should be, but barely any time or energy devoted to the unfortunate friends and families of Trumpers who don't share in the toxic ideology. People who have watched helplessly as a loved one falls down the alt-right rabbit hole deserve answers to how they got sucked in, and clear strategies to help them pull that person out of this fascist suicide cult. Maybe it's guilt by association, maybe it's an assumption that all people within a family or community have similar views, but whatever the cause is, it's a serious gap in the discourse. There are people like that. I've met them. I aim to fill this gap in the discourse with my poor editing skills and soothing nasally voice, and hopefully I can help people along the way. Now, before we get into it, it's worth taking a moment to mention here that research suggests that extremist belief can act as an addiction. Hatred itself can be addictive, and the social bonds with a toxic community can be genuinely hard to sever if a fascist tries to kick the habit. I'll put links to the research down below, but just bear this in mind if you are a friend or family member, that it's not your personal responsibility to change someone else's ideology. If you can, great, but it's not on you. The first insight on how to save someone from these cults of hatred comes from Dr. Kimmel, an academic who's interviewed former right extremists. Quote, "Of course, I'm not going to be able to persuade a guy to leave the movement because I say to him, I think your interpretation of page 156 of Mein Kampf is wrong. I'm going to help him by saying, you have a place to land, you have a place to stand, you have a family, you have kids, you have a partner, you have a job. You become a stakeholder in the system rather than an outsider in opposition to it. You have to give these people a place to land." Two things turn guys to this movement. First, there's a conscious and deliberate manipulation of the emotions of despair and confusion by those on the right, who basically massage these emotions into a politicized anger. The second thing is, it has to be experienced as something you're moving toward. You feel isolated and alone and despairing. You feel like you're failing your family. Then these guys come along and say, no, you're great, you're awesome, you're one of us, we are your brothers. You got community, camaraderie. You get people who are validating your masculinity. Then, of course, you get the sacred mission of preserving the white race. In other words, young white men generally turn to hate groups like the alt-right because they're being hurt emotionally by economic forces far outside their control. I do hope to do a deep dive on the indoctrination process for right extremists and the economic forces that have caused this extremism. But for now, all we really need to take away from this is that most join the alt-right to fill a very specific set of emotional needs that need to be replaced if someone wants to kick the addiction. A need for community, a need for masculinity, and a need for purpose. Generally, the type of person who joins the alt-right feels alone and helpless and hopeless and afraid and angry at a culture that promised them, as white men, a place above the poor, particularly poor minorities, and then failed to deliver. To get out, you need to offer them an alternative. As for what the alternative is, there is no clear consensus. There are a collection of strategies that have worked for relatively small organizations like Life After Hate. There are government-funded programs like the Norwegian Exit, and there are the self-reports of those who willingly left the lifestyle of white supremacy. The first one is called the Norwegian Exit. It is by far the most expensive approach, providing career counseling, new social groups, and therapy to help former extremists totally distance themselves from their cliques of alt-right friends. It also emphasizes parental intervention, as the base of the far right is often a set of 18 to 26-year-old men who usually still have some dependency and attachment to their family. It's a humane, holistic approach that research has found to be effective, but it's quite expensive. And our own government, here in America, doesn't seem particularly interested in funding social programs right now. That would, of course, take away from the bombing the Middle East budget. So, let's talk about a cheaper approach, but one with no less heart behind it. One founded by a man who knows what he's talking about when it comes to escaping white supremacy, McAlear. McAlear is the founder of Life After Hate, and he is himself a former hate group member. He was pulled out of it by the kindness of one of the minorities he spent years blaming his struggles on. It's actually a pretty inspiring read. I'll link it in the description. His take is that hate and racist beliefs are usually sparked by a flawed search for identity and purpose, and not an actually deeply held or logical conviction. His organization does not attack the rhetoric of fascism directly. He calls that the wrong approach, because it's about identity, not logic. The key, he believes, is listening and trying to reconnect with their, quote, buried humanity. You have to condemn the ideology and the actions, but not the human being themselves. He tries to get at what's motivating the hate, the fear or trauma that creates a need for this addictive rage of reactionary politics. He says, quote, I see them as lost. Somewhere along the line, they find themselves in this place, and it's not a fun place to be. When you surround yourself with people obsessed with hate, your life isn't firing on all cylinders. His organization does great work, but it's small, and it doesn't cover all of America. So, if we actually want to stem the tide of fascism that's sweeping the country, it's going to have to come from the friends and family of people who are watching their children, their brothers, their cousins, their friends, watching more and more Alex Jones clips, getting more of their news from Trump. And stop it before it's too late, before it ends in violence, the violence fascism always causes. I have to say, I know a lot of this probably sounds like sympathy for the devil. It's true that people who are falling for the alt-right are essentially engaging in the most objectionable ideology imaginable, one that advocates for the extermination of people unlike themselves. But if you want to actually fight fascism in this country, there's one clear way to do it, suggested by the research and people with experience at deradicalizing others. It's empathy. Showing empathy towards fascists can be what turns them back, as long as it's combined with a firm condemnation of the beliefs and the social structures that drew them into the alt-right. So, should we be showing empathy to these violent, loud assholes? Well, if they're your friend, or if they're your family, yeah, it's worth it. Thank you. Hey, I just want to make a quick note that my channel is not always going to be filled with depressing, heavy stuff, although I will be making some more serious video essays in the near future. I swear to God, this channel can be fun. Give it a shot, maybe. Alright, here's the credits.
Hey, like an unladen swallow starts a fist fight. Your right to property is antithetical to Christ. Hey, the time is right, so if you've got something to prove, so a fucking yellow and black triangle flag on your verse. I'd like to make a living kissing handcaps. See, I'm an animator that is painting a picture of Batman. The hammer of logic, condemned and admonished, anonymous, a topic, a market, and some fluffy handcuffs.